I'm in esteemed company with all of you and very delighted to moderate today's very important discussion. I had an intro created, but I almost want to toss it out and just speak plainly. I am absolutely inspired and moved by what I heard in the earlier session today, and I'm sure all of you feel the same. We are in a transformative time. Disruption is fraught with many opportunities. It's a period of anticipation and uncertainty. I know some of us, many of us perhaps, are worried about the future of our own jobs, but we're also excited about what's coming and what maybe our kids have to look forward to in the way of the future. So we are in a wonderful room today, this session, because this conversation is very unique in that the panelists we have today are experts in looking at what's ahead. Their entire career and scholarship has been devoted to forecasting the future and how society will adapt, both globally and locally across industries and sectors, with a focus on social inclusion, because we know many of the world's people and Americans are not adapting and will not know how they can harness the benefit of these disruptive technologies, but there is much hope. So I will introduce the panelists first, and then we'll carry on a discussion and open it up to Q&A. This is going to be a very conversational experience because I know a lot of you have the same kind of experiences that you have out there and a lot of industry experience to bear for the conversation. So I'll begin with introducing Dr. Eva Chalky, who is the research director, the executive director and research director of the Hunt Institute for Engineering and Humanity. Eva works closely with partners in academia, the private sector, and not-for-profit organizations to develop projects and initiatives that benefit disadvantaged communities around the world. Prior to joining SMU, Eva worked for the World Bank Group for 18 years with a focus on market-based solutions for environmental and social problems. She led the design and implementation of projects in 24 countries around the world and led programs in areas including energy efficiency, renewable energy, clean water access, and sustainable value chains. Eva was recently the recipient of the first IFC World Bank Innovation Award. She has an MS in Finance from George Washington University and an MA in Public Policy from Duke University, and has completed her PhD in Public Policy with a focus on globalization and development at Duke University. Next to Eva, we have the distinguished fellow, Regina Montoya. Many of us in Dallas know Regina. She is a celebrity in this space. She is a Harvard-trained attorney who has been nationally recognized as one of the top lawyers in the country. She is also a former award-winning television commentator and the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Texas Minority Council Program of the State Bar of Texas. Regina currently serves as the secretary of the board of directors of the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport and is chair of Mayor Rawlings' task force on poverty, his poverty task force. She is also the chief strategist at JMC Strategy Group and is writing a book about the importance of incorporating Latinos into the economic, political, and social fabric of America. Glad to have you. Next to Eva on the other side is Tunisia Boya Robinson. Tunisia is a Hunt Fellow as well. Ty received her MBA from Harvard Business School and has a dual degree in electrical engineering, computer science, and computer science from Duke University. Ty's experience as an entrepreneur, Six Sigma black belt, and technologist uniquely positions her to catalyze a results-driven era of social change. In her previous role as Chief Impact Officer of Living Cities, Tunisia was responsible for ensuring $100 million of investment, produced outcomes that improved the lives of low-income people across the country. In her book, Just Change, How to Collaborate for Lasting Impact, Tunisia shares her experience investing in cities and leaders across the country. The goal of Just Change is to help readers understand what's working, what's not, and how to improve their communities. And I'll add that I carry her copy in my bag because this is understandable for practitioners like me as well. And so she's incredible. The range of all of these experts is phenomenal. And last but absolutely not least, Xiaochen Zhang. a Hunt Institute Fellow. Xiao Chen is just in from China as of yesterday. Thank you for joining us. Xiao Chen is the president of FinTech for Good and Blockchain Frontier Group. He leads the design and implementation of FinTech for Good strategy, which aims to introduce impactful FinTech and blockchain solutions to frontier markets through incubation, acceleration, and investment. He brings more than 16 years of thought leadership and global experience to build impactful solutions and scale up innovative ideas in North America, Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Prior to FinTech for Good, Xiao Chen advised government agencies and multinational organizations in innovation, emerging technologies, and investment in positions at the World Bank, United Nations, and other international platforms. So thank you, and we'll get started. So I'm really excited to dig into conversation, and we're going to start at the top, and we are going to get as granular as we want to in this room. But it's worth starting with where did it all begin, Eva? Eva and I got to know each other as when I was consulting on communication for IFC when she was at the World Bank, and it was partially my job to help explain to regular people and the rest of the world the phenomenal transformative work that was being done across sectors in sustainable development in many countries that Eva was kind of masterminding. So we have someone here in the local market now who can speak to the highest level of where we're going and tell us where all of this began, please, in the context of the disruption that we're feeling today and also the changes in international development during your career.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming. So looking back really at the time you and I first met when we needed a translator for sustainability and sustainability finance was really the initial period of that. Up until the late 2000s, in international economic development, we mainly focused on just economic development. That's it. And then by the 2000s, early 2000s, it became very clear that climate change is happening, there is environmental degradation, and so by early 2000s, the environmental priority became very clear. So we started, in international organizations and international development, we started to be more intentional about the projects that were completed to at least not have a negative impact. So the primary focus was still economic development, but we wanted to make sure that at least these projects were not doing any harm to the environment. Very quickly, we started shifting towards things where we were looking for specific environmental benefit. But inclusion per se did not really become a clear priority until, frankly, fairly recently. And part of that has to do with the fact that when you look at what happened in the global economy, the last 30 years have experienced unprecedented growth. The GDP, global GDP tripled in just 30 years. And we were happy with that. We were really not looking at the nuances and the specifics and the details. But then it started becoming clear that in this era was obviously the era of globalization. This particular conference focuses on technological advancement, but I don't think we can talk about technological disruption without talking about globalization. Globalization and technology reinforce one another. Technology could not have had the kind of disruptive impact it had without globalization. And globalization couldn't have had the kind of impact it had without technology. The two really worked hand in hand. And lots of benefits came out of that. Dissemination of solutions and technologies, efficiencies, division of labor. All of these have enormous positive economic benefits as GDP growth demonstrated. But the benefits were not shared equally. And that's the recognition that we only started to have, frankly, a couple of years ago. So in international development, 5-6 years ago, we finally started focusing on inclusive development, inclusive economic development, which starts with, thank you so much, which starts with sustainable. Environmental sustainability was the baseline, but it finally had the recognition that just by promoting economic development, it doesn't mean that everybody will able to take advantage. So we have to take a much more nuanced approach. We have to take a nuanced approach that is cognizant of different social groups and cognizant of making sure that people don't fall behind. And it is difficult. But the challenge is very well articulated and demonstrated in the increase in inequality that we have been seeing pretty much globally. It is a global phenomena. And you often hear people talk about the reduced poverty, global poverty, as an evidence that this increase in improvement in global economics is working. And I just want to encourage everybody to just look at the details and the nuances. So that is actually true. And actually we heard Bill Gates, just I think a couple of days ago, had a big op-ed in the New York Times. And he was talking about how we have accomplished this amazing success of reducing extreme poverty very significantly around the world. And that is factually correct. When you look at some of the details, however, almost entirely, this reduction in global extreme poverty is coming from China. When you change when you take the Chinese number out, we actually haven't really made much progress in reducing extreme poverty. And at the same time, when you look at the numbers, working poverty has exponentially increased around the world. So people are in jobs, they are working hard, but they are still living in poverty. So that is basically the situation we are looking at. And Anna asked me to speak to global forces. So clearly globalization and technology have been driving global forces of both good, but also leading to some of these challenges. And the third global force that we like to mention is climate change. Because climate change is a reality that is making the life of those who are already behind and who are disadvantaged so much more difficult. So this is a little summary of it.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I know in my world, in the private sector, in consulting, when we talk about disruption, the immediate reaction is, well, of course, they're talking about disruptive innovation or disruptive technologies, and how can we leverage those to profit? And all of that is absolutely relevant to this discussion, and it'll be more in the latter half. First, though, just to kind of bring it home to the problem, at the level at which EVA is operating, particularly at the World Bank in these rarefied policy circles, there is a way of looking at the problem kind of in a removed sort of way. Meanwhile, though, we have leaders who are locally, such as Regina, who are feeling it and working with the people who could not articulate the forces nor explain where they're coming from. They just feel the daily stress and pressure that is really overwhelming. Could you speak to your experience in the last 20 years?
Thank you. Well, first off, let me mention what a delight and honor it is to be with all of you today. And I look around this room with the Community Council of Greater Dallas, the Federal Reserve, and many others who are here that are truly the experts working on this day to day on a daily basis. But I also want to thank the Hunt Institute for this opportunity to be here and to be part of this as a fellow, and also to the Collins family for having us in this fabulous building. Just as an aside, my college at Wellesley actually also has a Collins building too, because Mrs. Collins also provided something. So I feel a real kinship with that as well. But in talking about the international forces, several phrases came out of Eva's comments that I wanted just to repeat. And those were the benefits not shared equally, inequality, a global phenomenon, and then the working poor and working poor phenomenon as well. And interestingly, all of those comments can really be applied even to a city like Dallas, because as we look around and we are in this, again, really rarefied area here in this amazing campus, one would think then that all of the economic opportunities that we have seen in our region have been shared equally among all. Yet when you look at some of the numbers in Dallas that we've looked at, and just to give you a very quick snapshot of what we see, I wanted to share with you a few numbers and then talk to you a little bit about the equity issues that we're thinking about, even going all the way and drilling down to technology. So Dallas has seen amazing changes in the last 2 or 3 decades. It became a majority-minority city in the last 2 decades. Dallas right now is 42% Hispanic, 23% African American, 28% white non-Hispanic. But interestingly, at the same time, it also became a immigrant gateway city. 25% of Dallas is foreign-born. And even at this point, 43% of Dallas speaks another language other than English. So you can see how these changes and all of those changes have been occurring during that period of time. But the other phenomenon that really captured our attention and captured that of the mayor's attention with respect to the Mayor's Task Force on Poverty is something that Eva just mentioned, and that is the working poor situation. Because what we do have is a great economy in Dallas for jobs, but not all of the jobs that have been created for those people who haven't had the educational opportunities provide them with the benefits that they need, like health care. Because we do things differently in the United States from other countries with respect to health care and the universal aspects of that. And it is much more focused in on the employer and borne by the employer, and those are the benefits. We've seen those changes. We've also seen that basically in our community, about half of the households make less than $50,000 a year. And the median income had actually seen a drop in Dallas, not always because of the economic issues that we saw in our country in 2008 and 9. They were actually different from that because Dallas didn't suffer from some of the economic downturns like other cities in the United States. So as we started digging more deeply into those economic inequities, technology became one of those issues. As you can imagine from seeing some of the Gates op-eds and others, we had always for many years thought if there was ever an equalizer, it was going to be technology. Yet, when you look at the actual numbers, you'll see that in Dallas, about 10% of the households do not have internet access of white non-Hispanics, but 30% of African American households do not have that ability. The other phenomenon that we discovered too is that we think, that the smartphones are ubiquitous, and they are. And many people, even those that are working poor, know that that is their lifeline. But they may not actually have the limitless kinds of plans that many of you might have in this room, so that when you think about surfing on your smartphone and trying to find information, you don't really think about how many minutes you're using and how many gigabytes or any of those sorts of things. But other people do, because they have limited types of programs. And we're pushing more and more into that situation. Right now, if you want to take our Dallas area rapid transit, it really behooves you to have one of those smartphones, because that's how you're going to be paying for it, as you do in a lot of other countries. And so how then do you equalize it? So one of the areas that we're very much focusing in on in Dallas going forward are the equity indicators. How is it that we make it a level playing field for everyone? You're going to hear a little bit more, I suspect, about how, and I can't wait to hear some of the comments that Tunisia's going to make, but those comments about where you're born, what kinds of zip codes. What we have to ensure is that we give the opportunities for every child born in this city to be able to achieve his or her absolute and greatest potential. And how we have to do that is to say, what are the obstacles that a child in a particular zip code, and I'll pick one out from here, 75215 as an example, versus 75225 or 205, which are the Park cities, or even some of the other wealthier zip codes further north. How then do we ensure that the obstacles that have been placed before them don't create obstacles that they can't overcome? And I think that is perhaps one of the real lessons that we have to think through as we're thinking about these kinds of technological advances, the opportunities. Are there things that we are creating that no one is going to be able to overcome? And that is not an answer for us in the United States. Never has been, and it shouldn't be. So thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful synopsis. So we've explored for a bit the global disruptors and how some of these structural barriers are affecting opportunity here. I am excited to hear what Ty has to say on this, because in her book, she has a way of distilling all of these concepts into something that's actionable in the field for practitioners. Ty, I believe you refer to what we've just covered here as the opportunity gap. And please share with us how you define that and how you get out of it, more importantly.
Thanks again for having me as well. This is exciting to be here and happy to be part of the Hunt Institute and Eva's great vision. So the easiest way to think about the opportunity gap, particularly for the United States, is your zip code or your birth origin a predictor of your future success? And if it is, that means you have a gap in opportunity. Why does that matter? Our country is actually founded on the belief and principles of opportunity. And without that belief, people think about the money as a driver or so many other things as a driver, but it's actually the shared indomitable will of the United States that this is a country, a land of the free, a home of the brave, a place of opportunity. When you start to take that belief away, you start to see the things that you're seeing now. A scarcity mindset starts to replace an opportunity mindset. An opportunity mindset fuels future growth. An opportunity mindset creates new inventions and new frontiers and things where you don't know what's going to happen after AI. A scarcity mindset moves you to close your doors, to be more tribal, to look to your left and to your right, and instead of seeing a fellow American, a fellow citizen, you see a potential enemy. Our country is woven together by a diverse quilt and fabric of people who, no matter what their background is, believes that my tomorrow can be better than today with hard work. Without an opportunity mindset, that crumbles, and so does our democracy. And I know that sounds really, really dire, but I'm very optimistic. And one of the reasons why is I've seen across the country how the very same people that you might have said, that person doesn't have an opportunity, has worked together with others to create opportunity in their community. So we're talking about things like the demographic shift in our country. By 2030, Dallas is ahead of the curve. By 2030, our entire country will be majority of color. So it behooves us, forget about equity for a second, just in case that's not your thing. Think about how can our country compete in a global marketplace when the majority of our citizens now are from backgrounds and ethnicities who systematically have been underinvested in education and transportation and geographic amenities and benefits. We can't compete globally if we don't address the very systems that are underneath the foundation of this country that have resulted in the inequities. But the great news, guys, is those inequities were created by us, and those inequities can be solved by us. I'll give you an example. Minneapolis-St. Paul has one of the best economies in the country. But when you pull back the layers in areas where there's racially concentrated areas of poverty, they're off the charts. One of the first things that Minneapolis-St. Paul had to do to overcome that was actually get over their good Midwestern, want to tell their great ideas all the time, and we're great mindset, and confront the fact that we have a history of systematically underinvesting in certain communities. Only once they were able to address the fact that inequity was not something that was passive and happened by accident, but it was something that was the result of systemic policies, could they start to try to address it. What did they do? They worked backwards from what is it that we want to see in Minneapolis in the future? We want to see all people from Minneapolis be successful. So they did three things. The first is they went to the lived experience of the people who were facing that inequity. And in Minneapolis, St. Paul, there is a very large Somali population. So that meant the mayor at the time had to have translators, had to make sure that their website was in different languages. Oh, by the way, maybe we don't have the meeting for the community in the city hall. Maybe we have it in the apartment complexes after work when people have picked up their children. Maybe we serve food that makes the families feel like a community. Maybe we make sure that they know that this is their city too. So they started with the communities and got their voice. The next thing they did was they figured out, where are the bright spots already in this community? They had a very vibrant local economy. A lot of those owners and families were restaurant owners and actually purveyors of the culture of that community. So what they did was they reinvested in the businesses that already existed in the community because they were more likely to spread the wealth within their own community, and seeing folks who were economically successful from their own backgrounds pervade a sense of opportunity in that community. But the third thing, and this is where the rubber hits the road that was difficult, they had this grand plan that some brilliant woman or man who probably hangs out with Regina to build transportation across the city. Well, you know what? The way that the economic policies of where transit stops fell in the city were not going to be in any racially concentrated area of poverty. Not one. And actually, they could have easily said, well, that's not our fault. That's just the way the federal law works, and we can't get the money to work this way, and we got to make sure we make money if we're going to build this transit. But they had already agreed that this was going to be a city that was vibrant for everyone, not just the ones who were in power. So they went and they changed the federal guidelines of how stops got funded. And now every single racially concentrated area of poverty in Minneapolis has transit access. So folks who now believe that they can have opportunity can also move towards where the opportunity is. So that's one set of examples from one scenario on how we can work together to actually make our country continue to be a land of opportunity.
Thank you. And why don't you pass the mic on over to Xiaochen, because he'll be next. Gives us a lot of hope that there are best practices out there and there is a way forward at how we can do this type of work in our own community. But before we go into more of that, Xiaochen, give us a perspective from China and generally your work in social impact and emerging technologies and what you see as the place to focus.
Yeah, and again, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's a great opportunity for me to just meet with this distinguished guest here. And I really like what the Han Institute's mission to just make this inclusive agenda as important as other development-related agenda, because it's very clear that without inclusivity or without equity, that anything what we are talking about as of the progress we have achieved will not be continued properly. And we already, if we don't talk about the United States, we have enough examples from all other countries where the revolution happens. If you have a certain group of people based on color, based on whatever, even the location where you live, and then those just decide whether you have the shared prosperity or you are excluded from the opportunity. For those, if they see there's no hope, because I cannot change my color, I cannot change where I was born, I cannot change my gender, I cannot change my racial background. So if those are really, the element prevent me from being or sharing the prosperity, the only thing that I can do is that I need to change the system. So that's actually when you just go to different countries, see where the revolution happens. That's exactly where those driving forces. So that's the number one. Number two is that go back to Eva mentioned that the last 30 years from international development. It's really interesting to see that in different continents and many of the scientific approach just being put forward as how development should be done and how to help people, and then the numbers scientifically right, but actually doesn't really reflect the reality. And we already heard a lot of examples. We have the average extremely poverty reduction is great, but then taking one country out, then things changed. Then if we see that the basic service provision. If we just look at the national number, it's great, but when we see the last mile to those who really need to be helped, and the number changed. And if we see that the on average, the economic or the revenue or the income is great on average, but you go to certain race, certain group, certain gender, and you also see it's different. So the scientific approach, just using data to show progress, has problem. So then we have to just bring back those, equality-related indicator to see that, this at least we need to just double-check, triple-check to see that we achieve what we really want to achieve. One example is that from the, monitoring evaluation, we always see that, you get the M&E result based on how much you pay for it. Meaning what? That you want to just deliver healthcare to those who don't have that. And those people, live remotely in some area. And you want to build a hospital to serve them. But to just get data from that remote area is expensive. Finally, that's you just collect all the data in the cities, urban area, which actually is not the problem where that the impact investors or the investors want you to help. But because you don't have that budget to do the proper monitoring evaluation, you get back with the data to show result, which actually you didn't deliver to those who need to be helped. This can, happens in almost all the areas of, sectors we are talking about. So that's another factor that I want to mention. Another one is that, thinking about what are the key elements which can drive changes. And when I was still with World Bank, and we did a lot of surveys in different countries for startups, and the number one barrier for them to just grow, because SME in any country, they play the biggest or most important role for poverty alleviation. But the number one barrier they identify is always access to finance. And so, thinking about probably, most of you or all of you understand better that's how the SME access to finance in the US. And, if you just go to the VC round or you go to, banks, and if you go to bank, which means that you have collateral, you already are rich, you have property. And if you go to VC, means that you are in the club, you have access to the rich, to the money. And most of the SMEs who don't have either the collateral nor the access. So then those actually are going to provide the jobs and also the opportunities for more, but then they don't have equal access. And so, number one, that's how can we address that? And there are a lot of technology-based innovation. And starting from, Eva and I, when we were still at World Bank Group, that's looking at crowdfunding, how crowdfunding can provide an alternative, just basically break that club. And if even you don't have access to a club, you still actually have the access to the capital. And then we just move one step further. That's not only the capital is it matters, and crowdfunding provides some kind of interesting new way, but also that's now blockchain-based ICO, for example, initial coin offering, that's also just provide that kind of new innovative approach where that's individuals, entrepreneurs, innovators don't need to have everything ready, but can access to capital. Then we go to the technology divide. And the interesting part that before I came to US, and I thought that's from the Hollywood movie, that's this wonderful land and the equality and the prosperity. But after I landed here, and I do see, and we can compare US even with Africa in many aspects. And in many African countries, that's the internet or the access to mobile phone, like it's even 99% of population in many African countries have a mobile phone. but not in the U.S. That's, for me, it's ridiculous because this is totally different from my understanding or knowledge before I came to the U.S. And so the digital divide and also the inequality here actually, really provide, as in your language, opportunity. And the interesting thing that if you just read, a lot of the system theorists, how they define the next step of the change is really, how to drive the cost saving or reduce the cost for the system. If the cost of the system continue to increase, and then the system may collapse. And go back to, what are the biggest cost? Is the trust? Is the social inequality? Is, all the digital divide? And those kind of inequality provide a lot of, or generated a lot of cost, which if the system cannot really absorb, that will be the driving force for the systematic collapse or change. So I think that's, as we already heard a lot of things, what happened or what is, the reality here in Dallas or in US or in, worldwide. And this generate us opportunity, how to use technology, how to use capital, how to use education to really bring equality back into the shared prosperity, not only outside in the least developing country, but also back here home in Dallas or in the US. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an incredible overview. So what you've just covered, Xiaochen, is really echoing. We're hearing a lot of the common themes, aren't we? The digital divide, inequity. There's a mountain of opportunities that we can leverage, and these key points of leverage are where we can focus more on the solutions. One of them goes back to Eva's extraordinary work, are global value chains. Could you speak to the role of the private sector and specifically your work in global value chains to kind of address some of these issues?
Thank you. So I am personally very much convinced of the important potential for the private sector to take a lead on some of these problems. And it may sound like a paradox for some, but I actually don't believe so. So I just want to mention an example. So as many of you have heard of the Mdgs and the Sdgs. So in international development, some of the key objectives were basically defined in first the Mdgs. These are the Millennium Development Goals. And those were not really published until year 2000. And then those were replaced later by the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So the MDGs in 2000 tried to articulate the focus on some of the environmental issues, and it's really not until 2015, the SDGs, that the social inclusion type of priorities got defined. Having said that, some of my favorite examples of inclusive business, Danone in 2006 was already working in Bangladesh with Grameen, basically making yogurt for very low-income communities where they created jobs. They had manufacturing facilities where jobs were created, and they basically supplied a very high nutrient yogurt product for the local market. And they were very intentional in collaboration with Grameen. They helped define what were some of the most important lacking nutrients locally, especially for children, and they made sure that those were actually added into this yogurt. And they have been successfully doing this since 2006. Another favorite example of mine, Unilever. Unilever has the famous Shakti Program, which probably many of you have seen in India. To date, they have created more than a network of 80,000 entrepreneurs. And the whole idea is that it is really hard to reach rural India, and they have recognized the power of the small entrepreneurs, and they train local women to be micro-entrepreneurs to basically take the Unilever products to the most remote villages. And there are 80,000 of them which are making a beautiful living out of that. So there are two problems solved at once. They created a ton of opportunities, livelihood opportunities, and at the same time, they are providing products that these areas need. So when we bring it back local, food desert, it is, I share, Xiao Chen's sentiments. It's like, it's surreal. Having come to Dallas a few years ago and somebody mentioned this notion of the food desert in a US town, it's like, how can that happen when there are the most remote rural Indian villages are being supplied with products? So this Unilever started this in 2010, and in the matter of 8 years, basically they created this phenomenal, extensive network of 80,000 micro entrepreneurs, and it's rapidly growing, and they have now replicated it in multiple countries. So the private sector does have the ability, and especially with, Anna mentioned value chains, and value chain was actually my doctoral dissertation, because I do think that's the special power. I think the special power of large corporates is their value chain. So another example is Novartis. So social enterprise out of Stanford created a baby warmer. It is very hard for a small social enterprise to scale because there is an economies of scale. Getting products to the places where they are needed can be very expensive. So Novartis and this social enterprise partnered up. Novartis already had an extensive network, a value chain, a distribution channel, a logistics channel, so they could actually use that existing infrastructure to get this additional product to the places where they were needed. So I have become convinced that this is really the value chain, in addition to the in-house expertise that corporates have, that it can really be leveraged for enormous social impact, and especially to scale social impact. To repeat the Novartis example, the social enterprise came up with the product, but they had no way of scaling it. The partnership gave them the mechanism to actually get this solution to scale. So working with some of these companies in my previous life at the World Bank has really led to my academic interest in this area. And so partly through my own doctoral work, and since then in the Hunt Institute with collaborators like Anna and our panelists today, we have been studying these best practices, models that have scaled. And so we have actually collected 300 of them from around the world, models, private sector driven models that have managed to have very significant impact. And we try to figure out what are the patterns. How can we make this possible? How could we create a formula that perhaps can help others as well? And a key element of this that I would love to mention, and then I'll pass it on because I know I'm taking too long, is that the private sector really has the potential to take a lead, but there is very important role for other stakeholders to play. It's really important. I'm glad you mentioned SME, Xiao Chen. Small and medium-sized enterprises globally and in the US pretty much are responsible for over 60% of all jobs. So the large corporate working very intentionally with the small businesses is a very important piece of that, and in a highly participatory fashion to come up with a structure that works for both. And we found that there is the unique kind of entity, or actually maybe not so unique, but we didn't used to talk about it in that sense. There are the enablers. And the enabler may be the public sector. In some cases, it's government, but in many cases, it's not. It may be a nonprofit. It may be another private entity that is able to provide some of the organization that can aggregate the small businesses so that the large company can work with them. So there are many different types, but there is that enabler function that actually helps make this inclusive model work. And almost every single one of the scaled models had that. They are often not talked about. They are not the ones on the kind of website and in the newspaper, but they are, when you start digging down, they are there making things work in the background.
When I hear Eva talk about enablers, I want to jump out of my seat, because this is exactly where I entered the picture with her. 4 years ago, I heard her talk about this very subject. And I was, at the time, a struggling independent consultant. And anyone here who's ever done that knows how difficult it is to get into those value chains, through procurement, that does not appreciate what micro entrepreneurs have to offer in this space. When she talked about the importance of enablers and the power of social enterprise, I feel like I'm in both those categories, and please help me. So it was very much in the spirit of what can we do as an individual to navigate all of this. So we've spoken a lot to the low income populations that are affected with this, and that is something we will all have to worry about due to societal risks coming about from lack of inclusion. But I'd like to hear one more kind of round from each of you on the power of the individual to correct this or find opportunity within this. And we'll start with Regina.
Well, I think, we certainly have seen many examples of the individuals who have made such an extraordinary change and impact. And these are the Nobel Prize winners. These are all of these. But I do think that one thing that we also have to recognize is that in order to make these kinds of changes faster and to allow us all to compete, because I think something that Tai was saying and that also Xiaoshen was saying in terms of the competition, that's what I look at when I'm looking at our students in Dallas and how they're going to be able to compete. They're not necessarily competing with the kids in Plano anymore or the kids in Prosper, but in Hong Kong, like the kids I saw last week when I was there, and they were on their subway reading and working and literally on the subway with their chemistry books in English, which they had just received and were doing work. So I think I would change it just a little bit to say, how can we ensure that individuals are able to scale what it is that they want, that they seek will make a difference? Because perhaps that is part of what we see great ideas, but how do we create models for those great ideas to be scaled and to be systemic? Because if we don't operate in a systemic kind of way, we'll end up just doing a little here and there and not making the kind of impact. I mean, to give you some numbers, even with children living in poverty in Dallas, we're talking 95,000 kids. It's a big, big number. And Dallas isn't particularly unusual from other big cities. We have perhaps a little bit higher percentage than some, but these are the kinds of numbers we're talking about. So I guess what I would really encourage and hope for are how do we create the methods and mechanisms for the individuals to make that difference in a systemic, operationalized, and in a large way as well.
So I like Regina, kind of move a little bit from the individual. And one of the reasons why is, how many people think you can solve poverty by yourself? Anyone? Then I'm talking to you after this session. But I do think, there is something about the American spirit that loves the hero story, loves the Superman or the Wonder Woman who flies in, swoops in, has the great idea and fixes everything. But to really get out of the mess that we created, we have to create the answer as a group. So one example I have is an investment I'm in the middle of due diligence on right now that is a software platform that matches education, job seekers, and jobs. And it does it through a competency-based model. So think about the traditional education system. A degree, and I know we're in the hallowed halls of academia, but I don't have any problem being disruptive. A degree is a proxy. It's a transfer of credibility. It is not in and of itself value. It is what I believe your value is, right? Well, when you look at educators, a lot of folks are saying the education is not meeting the needs of the students. When you look at companies, if you look at the percentages, they're saying college graduates are coming out less and less prepared for the workforce. And then when you look at job seekers, they're like, I know I work hard. I know I can add value. I don't know how to position myself to this organization. So the software platform I'm in the middle of doing due diligence on now takes lived experience, translates it into competencies, and then has also worked with the corporate partners to match their jobs, not by what degree you had, what school you went to, where you lived, but actually drill down those things into a set of competencies. The algorithm matches immediately. You're kind of like a match.com, but for jobs. And let's say I was 68% of a match to this job that I really wanted. The algorithm will now spit back to you, hey, you can take these 2 classes at this time that works for your schedule and bump up your match rate within the next 3 weeks. So it is a forward-moving way for a person to say, I'm not a match now, but I can be a match tomorrow. It's a way for a company to say, I don't have to scour through these resumes and I'm actually not sure if it's meeting my skills or not. I know right away what the competencies are. And it's a way for the individual to say, you know what? I am getting something from all the other things I do in my community. Every time I show up to a city hall meeting and I give feedback, every time I organize a group of people in my community to help something or change something, those are a set of competencies and leadership skills that I've developed, and I need to be able to position that in a way that shows my economic value. That is a partnership that got there. And what we're seeing as a result of it is stickier employment, career pathway and progression amongst communities of color and communities that normally wouldn't get employed. And then also business benefit just through a software platform, and folks being mindful of an asset-based approach to this issue as opposed to, well, let's just send them all through the system that we know isn't working so much anyway and hope we get more out of it. So that's one example of my case that gives me a hope for opportunity.
Yeah, and this question just also bring me back to my career path after I left the World Bank, and either I becoming a startup, or I join a corporate, or I become someone who I do something that I'm doing now, and so that's basically is to make that decision. The number one question is that I need to answer is that do I want to be a changing agent myself, or do I want to be an enabler to enable others to change, and what can I offer to them? And after all the years of involvement in the international development, and my gut tells me that my changing agent is really the startups, and I want to help them. They have extremely potential, a great potential, but they have really a lot of barriers for them to just be successful. And one example is that just last week when I was still in China, and the American Chamber of Commerce organized this summit, and I was on the same panel with Microsoft. Then the panelists asked me that, can you predict in the future that how to just keep the corporate to be competitive in the future, considering all the emerging technology and all that. And the number one thing that I just provide to them was that the organization in the future has to open the border, open the boundary to just why? Because all the talents exist outside of your organization. Even as big, as powerful, as talented as Microsoft, you cannot compete with the whole world. And if those organizations who just have all the individuals, changing agents, working together with them, they can really beat Microsoft easily. So that's we are seeing that go back to how individual really play a role here. If the corporate open their border or organization, and through an open innovation process, individuals can really provide their talents to just do better and bigger. And we are seeing this from the blockchain-based new type of organization. One example is it's called DAO, Distributed Autonomous Organization, which actually just basically individuals are connected as nodes in the network, contributing to the network with the incentive directly to the individual, but for a greater good of. So this kind of organization in the future definitely has a lot of advantage over the existing closed border type of organization. So there, that individual will play much bigger role, and each one of us will, have a significant role to play. And number two is that thinking about the problems, and a larger organization, probably more established, then they already they are looking at the market, and they probably are not looking at the smaller problems which hinder the system change. And one example is that we look at different aspects in the SDGs and identify how the blockchain-based startups can help them to just do or develop a new business model to just do things totally different. And we in the again, that's access to finance part. That's we a lot of SMEs started to using ICO, initial coin offering, initial token offering, to just not only access to capital, but also to provide incentive to their clients, the customers, with the capital they don't have. And that can help them to engage the community in a much more effective way. And number two is that in the energy space, that's we know that in many countries the grid cannot be extended in a very effective way or efficient way to the remote areas. But electricity is really the key for the poverty alleviation in many remote areas. And then in many of the power plants which are being constructed in the remote areas, but then they first have to sell to the grid. Grid has to extend to the remote areas, which doesn't happen. So blockchain-based peer-to-peer trading platform for energy, and that can actually just use having the neighbors to just generate electricity from their power from their solar, then to just be sold directly to the neighbors, and without having the great infrastructure to be extended there. And then we also look at the financial access part from the individuals. A lot of individuals are not bankable because of in lack of identity. Because in lack of identity, and there's no the credit score is really low, and the banks, financial institutes, think that it's too risky, too costly to offer them service. So from blockchain-based solution where that's each of the transaction, for example, P2P lending transaction, that they can collect, this startup we are helping, that they can collect more than 100 data points. And from accumulation of many transactions throughout a year, then this individual having a digital identity, and all the data can just be uploaded on a public chain, which is trustworthy. Individuals have the data autonomy, and then they can offer the data to the service provider, say that if you give me financial service, I give you this kind of data. If it's electricity, I give you this kind of data. Because I gave you the data, that you should also reduce the costs for the service provision. And in this, that we enable the individuals to becoming their own changing agent. And there are many, many more other examples where that startups using a new technology can really come up with a new solution which can transform how the business is done, how the service is provided, and also how the poverty reduction is being achieved.
Well, on that very hopeful note, I'm afraid we're out of time. I suppose we could take one question. It might be. Let me say, we do have on these flash drives an overview report that is a short summary of the larger paper that will come out on October 15th. And there'll be many opportunities to convene through the Institute. Corey Harris is here, and Dr. Chalky, and many of the people in this room are affiliated or working with the Institute. So please continue the discussion with us. We're really excited about what's coming. We've barely scratched the surface. So thank you.